Eliza hadn't intended to fall into an affair. The very thought seemed absurd a year ago, when her life had felt steady, predictable. She was a woman of routine, a mother of 2 grown children, and married for over 20 years to Marcus, a man who had been her rock. They had built a beautiful home together, a life marked by comfort and security. But somewhere along the way something had shifted. It wasn't that she no longer loved Marcus, she did. Or at least she thought she did. But the years had worn their passion down to a soft hum, barely noticeable beneath the noise of everyday life. And then there was Aaron. He had arrived that summer to photograph their estate for an architectural magazine. He was young, only 24, just a few years older than her own son, and full of energy that Eliza hadn't felt in years. His dark hair, the easy smile, the way he moved with quiet confidence, it all stirred something inside her she hadn't expected. At first, she tried to push it away. She was too old to be thinking like this, too settled to entertain fantasies about a man half her age. But there was something about Aaron that she couldn't ignore. He was kind in a way that felt genuine, interested in her in a way that Marcus hadn't been for a long time. He lingered after his work was done, asking her about her life, her passions, her dreams. It was intoxicating the way he listened to her, the way his eyes seemed to light up when she spoke. Their conversations had started innocently enough, but there was always an undercurrent, a spark of something dangerous that Eliza couldn't help but be drawn to. She told herself it was harmless. A little flirtation never hurt anyone, right? But as the days turned into weeks, the line between harmless and something much more serious began to blur. One evening, after Marcus had left on another business trip, Aaron stayed late. The summer heat hung heavy in the air as they sat together on the porch, the sun dipping below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink. Eliza had felt it then, the tension between them, the pull of something she wasn't sure she wanted to name. "I've been thinking about you," Aaron said, his voice low and steady, his gaze fixed on her in a way that made her heart skip a beat. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "You shouldn't," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," he said, leaning in just a fraction closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I can't help it." It was in that moment that everything changed. The weight of their unspoken desires hung thick between them, and without thinking, Eliza leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her body. It was soft at first, tentative, as if both of them were testing the waters of something they knew they shouldn't be doing. But then the dam broke, and the kiss deepened, became hungry, desperate. Aaron's hands were on her, pulling her closer, and Eliza felt something inside her awaken, something she had thought had died years ago. The kiss was filled with years of pent-up frustration, of longing for something more, something she hadn't realized she was missing until now. They pulled apart, both breathless, staring at each other in the fading light. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, and Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. "I shouldn't have," she started, but Aaron cut her off. "Don't say that," he whispered, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin in a way that sent shivers down her spine. "You felt it too." "I know you did." Eliza closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite the voice in her head screaming at her to stop. She did feel it. She felt it with a force that terrified her. But she was married. She had a life, a family. She couldn't just throw it all away for a man she had only just met, a man young enough to be her son. "We can't do this," she said, though her body betrayed her, leaning closer to him, her lips brushing against his once more. "We already are," he murmured against her mouth, and with that, the last of Eliza's resolve crumbled. They spent the night together, tangled in the sheets of the guest room, their bodies pressed together in a way that made Eliza forget, if only for a moment, about the consequences. In Aaron's arms she felt alive, desired in a way she hadn't felt in years. The guilt that gnawed at her was buried beneath the intensity of their passion, but even as they lay together in the quiet aftermath, she knew it would come roaring back to life once the sun rose. Eliza awoke before dawn, the pale light of the early morning filtering through the curtains. Aaron slept soundly beside her, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She watched him for a moment, the weight of what they had done crashing down on her like a wave. How could she face Marcus after this? How could she go back to her life, her marriage, knowing what she had done? Carefully, she slipped out of bed, gathering her clothes from the floor and dressing quietly. She couldn't bear to wake Aaron, couldn't bear to see the look in his eyes, the questions he would undoubtedly ask. Instead, she crept out of the guest house and made her way back to the main house, her heart heavy with guilt and confusion. Days passed, and Eliza tried to pretend that nothing had changed. She went through the motions, smiling at Marcus, making small talk at dinner, but inside she was a mess. Every time she looked at him, all she could think about was Aaron. His hands on her body, his lips on hers. The guilt was suffocating, but the memory of that night was intoxicating. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wanted more. Aaron had kept his distance after that night, giving her space, though she could feel his eyes on her whenever they crossed paths in the garden or the house. He was waiting for her to make a decision, to decide what she wanted. And Eliza didn't know if she could give him an answer. The breaking point came one evening, a week after their night together. Marcus was in his study, working late as usual, and Eliza found herself wandering through the garden, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and longing. She hadn't seen Aaron all day, and she found herself missing him, missing the way he made her feel. She found him by the rose bushes, his camera in hand as he photographed the flowers in the fading light. He looked up when he saw her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, and Eliza felt her heart skip a beat. Without a word, she walked toward him, her feet carrying her across the garden as if they had a mind of their own. When she reached him, she stopped, her eyes searching his for answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "I can't stop thinking about you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the breeze rustling through the leaves. Aaron set his camera down, his gaze intense as he stepped closer to her. "Then don't," he said simply, his hand reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere." The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words and unshed tears. Eliza's heart raced in her chest, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn around and walk away before it was too late. But her body betrayed her once again, and before she knew it, she was in Aaron's arms, their lips crashing together in a kiss that was both desperate and tender. They fell into each other once more, their bodies moving in sync as they gave in to the desire that had been building between them for weeks. It was different this time, softer, more intimate, but the fire was still there, burning just as hot as it had that first night. When it was over, they lay together in the grass, the stars twinkling above them in the night sky. Eliza felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years, but it was tinged with sadness, with the knowledge that this couldn't last. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she rested her head on Aaron's chest. "I can't keep living like this, but I can't lose you either." Aaron sighed, his hand gently stroking her hair. "You don't have to decide right now," he said softly. "We'll figure it out." But Eliza wasn't so sure. Eliza didn't go back to the house that night. She stayed with Aaron under the stars, feeling the warmth of his body against hers as the world around them slipped into darkness. The gentle rise and fall of his chest calmed her, lulling her into a sense of peace she hadn't felt in so long. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget everything. The weight of her marriage, the inevitable fallout, and the guilt that lurked in the corners of her mind. But when the sun broke the horizon, its golden light washing over the garden, reality came crashing down. She hadn't planned for any of this, hadn't thought beyond the immediate desire that had consumed her. And now, with Marcus home in the day ahead, the enormity of her betrayal gnawed at her, twisting her stomach into tight knots. "I should go," she whispered, pulling herself from Aaron's embrace as the first signs of morning stretched across the sky. Aaron stirred beside her, his arm instinctively reaching out to pull her back. "Stay a little longer," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. Eliza closed her eyes, savoring the moment, but she knew she couldn't stay. There was no hiding from what she had done, no escaping the consequences of her actions. She had to face Marcus, had to somehow explain why she hadn't come to bed last night. But what could she possibly say? How could she look him in the eye and lie, again and again, knowing the truth was festering inside her? With a heavy heart, she rose to her feet, brushing the dirt and grass from her clothes. "I can't, Aaron. Not this time." He sat up, concern flashing in his eyes as he watched her. "What are we doing, Eliza?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with a sadness that mirrored her own. I don't want to lose you, but I know this can't go on forever. She paused, her throat tight with the emotion she was struggling to keep at bay. I don't know what to do either, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But I can't keep living two lives. It's tearing me apart. Aaron stood and took a step toward her, his fingers gently brushing her arm as he looked at her with those intense, searching eyes. Then maybe it's time to make a choice, he said, his voice steady, though Eliza could see the conflict playing out behind his calm facade. I won't pressure you, but I can't be your secret anymore. His words struck a chord deep within her. The truth she had been avoiding for so long finally laid bare. She couldn't continue like this, sneaking around, living in the shadows of her own life. But the thought of ending things with Aaron sent a wave of pain crashing through her, a hollow ache settling in her chest. She nodded slowly, her heart heavy. I'll talk to Marcus, she said, though the thought terrified her. She couldn't predict how it would go. Couldn't know if it would be the end of her marriage or the beginning of something new. I owe him that much. Aaron gave her a small, sad smile and leaned in to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. I'll be here, whatever happens. With a final lingering glance, Eliza turned and walked back toward the house, her heart pounding in her chest. As she crossed the threshold and entered the quiet, still home, the familiar scent of Marcus's aftershave hung in the air, a sharp reminder of the life she was about to shatter. Her feet felt heavy as she made her way to the kitchen, where Marcus sat at the table, reading the newspaper and sipping his coffee. He looked up when she entered, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in her disheveled appearance. You're up early, he said, his voice laced with mild surprise. Everything okay? Eliza's heart clenched in her chest, her throat tight as she struggled to find the words. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her head, but now, standing in front of him, the weight of it all threatened to crush her. Marcus, we need to talk, she said softly, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. He lowered the newspaper, his expression shifting to one of concern as he set his coffee cup down. What's going on, Eliza? You're scaring me. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the back of the chair, steadying herself before she spoke. I've done something I'm not proud of, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been seeing someone. The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stared at her, the color draining from his face as her words hung in the air between them like a bomb waiting to detonate. What are you saying? He asked, his voice low, almost as if he didn't want to hear the answer. Tears welled in Eliza's eyes as she took a shaky breath. I've had an affair, Marcus. I've been seeing Aaron. For a moment he didn't say anything, his face a mask of disbelief. But then slowly the realization set in, and the pain that flickered across his features was like a knife to Eliza's heart. You've been seeing him, he repeated, his voice hollow. How long? Eliza couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze, the guilt twisting inside her like a vice. A few months, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Marcus stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. He raked a hand through his hair, his breathing uneven as he tried to process what she had just told him. I can't believe this, he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. I thought we were happy. I thought you were happy. Eliza wiped at her tears, her heart breaking as she watched the man she had spent most of her life with unravel before her. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice shaking. I never wanted to hurt you, Marcus, but somewhere along the way I lost myself. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, his hands shaking as he leaned against the counter. So what? You just decided to screw around with a guy half your age to find yourself? He snapped, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. Is that it, Eliza? Was it worth it? Eliza flinched at his words, the sting of his anger cutting deep. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. It wasn't like that. I didn't plan for any of this. But you did it anyway, Marcus shot back, his voice rising. You threw away everything we've built, everything we've been through for what? A fling. Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, her heart aching with the weight of her actions. I'm sorry, she sobbed, the words feeling hollow in the face of his pain. I never wanted this to happen, Marcus. I never wanted to hurt you. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his chest heaving with the force of his emotions. Finally, he shook his head, his face a mixture of heartbreak and disbelief. "I need some time," he said, his voice strained. "I need to think." He brushed past her, his footsteps heavy as he made his way toward the front door. Eliza stood frozen, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation, her mind swirling with guilt, regret, and a deep hollow ache for what she had lost. When the door slammed shut behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. For days Marcus didn't come home. He stayed with a friend, according to the brief texts he sent, leaving Eliza to grapple with the fallout of her actions alone. The house felt empty without him, the quiet a constant reminder of the fracture she had caused. She tried to call Aaron, to seek comfort in the one person who had made her feel alive again, but he didn't answer. Days turned into a week, and the ache in her chest grew with each passing hour. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marcus returned. His face was pale, his eyes tired, and when he looked at her, it was as though he was seeing someone he no longer recognized. "We need to talk," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Eliza nodded, her heart pounding in her chest as she sat across from him at the kitchen table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence thick with tension. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Marcus began, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it that made Eliza's stomach twist. "About us, about what happened. I'm not going to pretend that what you did didn't hurt me, because it did. More than I can put into words." Eliza wiped at her tears, her throat tight with emotion as she waited for him to continue. "But I also know that we've both been drifting apart for a long time," he said softly. "I didn't see it at first, but looking back, I can't pretend that everything was perfect between us. We've both been going through the motions, living side by side, but not really living." Eliza's heart ached at his words, the truth of them cutting through her like a blade. She had known deep down that their marriage had been faltering, but she hadn't been able to face it. Instead, she had turned to Aaron, seeking comfort in the arms of someone who made her feel alive again. Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know if we can come back from this, Eliza," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." A sob escaped her lips and she reached out for his hand, desperate for some sign that he might still love her, that there might still be a chance for them. "I'm so sorry, Marcus," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I love you. I do. I lost myself." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and for a moment she saw the flicker of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But then just as quickly it was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. "I think we need time apart," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Maybe we'll find our way back to each other, maybe we won't. But right now I need space." Eliza's heart shattered at his words, the finality of them sinking in. She had known this might happen, had prepared herself for the possibility, but hearing it out loud was a different kind of pain, a pain that cut deep into her soul. She nodded, unable to speak through the tears that threatened to choke her. Marcus stood then, and without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving Eliza alone with the weight of her choices. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Eliza found herself navigating a new kind of loneliness. She no longer saw Aaron, the affair that had once consumed her now a distant memory, tainted by the destruction it had caused. Marcus had moved out, and though they spoke occasionally, it was clear that their relationship had shifted into something unrecognizable, something that might never be repaired. Eliza wasn't sure what the future held, whether she would ever find her way back to Marcus, or if they would remain two people who had once loved each other, but had drifted too far apart to come back together. But as she stood in the garden one evening, the same garden where she had first met Aaron, she realized that, for the first time in a long while, she was beginning to find herself again. It wasn't the same as it had been with Aaron. It wasn't driven by desire or passion or the thrill of the forbidden. It was quieter, more introspective, a journey inward rather than outward. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above her, Eliza allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was still a future for her. One where she could learn to love herself again.